Lonely grandfather. Found an abandoned bull. What he did changed his life forever. The sound came sharp and sudden, metal scraping against metal, followed by a low, ragged breath that didn't belong to the wind. Walter Griggs stopped mid-step, the walking stick in his right hand digging into the dirt path beneath him. He turned toward the overgrown fence line, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his weathered cap. There it was again, a strained metallic rattle followed by a wet snort. Not the rustle of raccoons or the distant calls of coyotes, but something bigger, alive, in pain. He pushed through the waist-high weeds edging the old pasture. The field hadn't been used in years. Its gate hung half off its hinges, and barbed wire curled in dangerous coils across the broken posts like forgotten traps. As Walter made his way toward the sound, a sour smell hit him. Blood, sweat, rot. Then he saw it. The bull. It was massive, even in its collapsed state. Dark hide streaked with dried mud and blood, ribs jutting through thin skin, flanks heaving with every tortured breath. One of its front legs was twisted under its body, tangled in rusted barbed wire that had once formed the perimeter fence. Flies buzzed in clouds around its face, and its nostrils flared with each shallow exhale. Walter's first instinct was to back away. Whatever this animal was, it looked half dead already. But then the bull opened one eye, just one, and it locked onto him. There was no fear in that look, no wild panic like most wounded animals. Just weariness, suffering, and something deeper. Recognition? Understanding? Walter felt his chest tighten. "Easy, fella," he muttered, almost without thinking, his voice gravelly from disuse. "I ain't here to hurt you." He took a cautious step forward. The bull didn't flinch. Another step. Still no movement. Walter glanced at the leg. Blood caked around the barbed wire, flesh torn in places where the animal had clearly struggled to free itself. Walter dropped his walking stick and reached into his coat pocket for his folding knife. His hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but he moved with purpose, cutting the wire slowly, carefully, until the last loop slid free and the leg dropped to the ground. The bull snorted weakly and tried to shift, but its muscles gave out. It collapsed fully into the grass, eyes still locked on Walter. He stood there a moment, breathing hard, wiping sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. "I'm going to get you out of here," he whispered. It took him nearly 20 minutes to limp back to his house, collect supplies, and return. A hammer, bolt cutters, rope, bandages, a bucket of water. He moved slower than he wanted to, cursing under his breath with every step, but he got it done. The whole time, the bull waited. Watched. By the time the sun dipped behind Hollow Ridge, the bull had been freed, the wounds bandaged as best Walter could manage, and a crude sling made from 2 wheelbarrow frames and an old tarp was dragging the beast inch by inch toward Walter's property. He had no idea how he managed to get the animal that far. Maybe adrenaline, maybe something else. Purpose, maybe. He built a makeshift stall beside the garage with leftover planks and nails. It was barely strong enough to hold the animal, but the bull didn't resist. It simply stood there, wobbling on its legs, until it lowered itself slowly onto the hay Walter had piled in the corner. The next morning, Walter was out before sunrise, limping to the stall with a pan of water and a handful of old apples. The bull sniffed, but didn't eat. Not yet. Still, he was alive. Walter stared at the animal for a long moment. "Iron," he said aloud. "That's what I'll call you, Iron." He smiled to himself, surprised at how right the name felt. But his peace didn't last. Later that day, as he returned from the hardware store with antiseptic and stronger rope, he found something nailed to his barn door. A single piece of paper, typed. No name, no signature. "Stay away from property that doesn't belong to you." His heart thudded. He looked around, but the road was empty. No cars, no people, just wind in the trees. He folded the note and tucked it in his coat. Didn't tell anyone, didn't go to the sheriff, just got to work. Over the next few days, Walter cleaned Iron's wounds and fed him small meals, each day a little more than the last. He read aloud from old Western novels as he brushed the bull's coat, the words filling the air with something other than silence. Sometimes Iron would tilt his head as if listening. Walter began to talk more freely. To the bull, to himself, to the ghosts in the corners of his mind. But then came the brand. It was barely visible under the layer of grime and scar tissue, a faded, deliberate mark on Iron's left flank. Walter didn't notice it until the third day while cleaning a wound. He paused, leaned closer, and wiped the area clean. What he saw chilled him, a triangle with two parallel lines cutting through the center. It wasn't a ranch brand, not any ranch from around Pinevale anyway. It looked institutional, official, familiar. That night, after Iron had eaten and drifted to sleep, Walter sat on his porch with an old army trunk at his feet. He hadn't opened it in years. Inside were mementos from a different time, tools, ID cards, a faded uniform, and a stack of photos. One photo stood out. His old friend Harold Cray, standing next to a pen of animals. Calves, barely a few weeks old, each with that same brand on their side. Harold had gone missing over 20 years ago. He'd been working in military logistics, said he'd been reassigned to a new government project out west. After that, nothing. No letters, no calls, just gone. Walter stared at the photograph, his hand tightening around the edges. "What were you into, Harold?" he whispered. The next day he took a closer look at Iron, the way he moved, the way he responded to voice commands with unnatural calm. He wasn't just intelligent, he was aware. He watched, learned. Walter began testing simple tasks, clapping twice before feeding, tapping the stall post to call him over. Iron followed without hesitation. It wasn't just luck that this bull had survived, it was design. The thought sent a shiver down Walter's spine. That night he dreamed of sirens, of floodlights sweeping over fields, of Harold's voice shouting across a radio, broken and desperate. He woke in a cold sweat, gasping, heart racing. He went to Iron's stall just to see him, to make sure he was real. Iron lifted his head and blinked slowly, then lowered it again with a soft grunt. Walter placed a hand on the bull's shoulder. "I don't know what you are," he said, voice barely a whisper. "But somebody wanted you gone." And as the wind picked up outside and shadows moved across the ridge, Walter couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching them. He stepped back from the stall and looked toward the tree line. Somewhere, deep in the woods, something shifted. A low crack, like a foot on dry twigs. Walter's eyes narrowed. Walter began to suspect that Iron was not an ordinary bull, and that someone, somewhere, didn't want him alive. The photo fell from the old envelope like a forgotten truth. Walter stared at it, heart thumping hard against his ribs. In it, Harold Cray stood in a dusty yard, smiling and holding a calf no bigger than a medium-sized dog. The brand was clear, burned into the animal's flank, a triangle crossed by two parallel lines, the same one on Iron. The photo was dated 18 years ago. Walter sat on the floor of his attic, the musty air closing in around him as he flipped through the rest of the album. Pages rustled beneath his calloused fingers. Most photos were harmless, old job sites, holiday dinners, a fishing trip. But in the back, hidden behind a torn envelope, were letters. Faded, typed, and marked confidential. They were addressed from Harold to a man named Dr. Lyle Mercer. Walter read each line slowly, carefully. Phrases jumped out at him. Project Redwood, adaptive livestock, controlled aggression, neurological mapping. None of it made sense at first, but as he pieced the letters together, it hit him. Iron wasn't just bred for strength, he was bred to think. Walter leaned back against the attic wall, the wood creaking under his weight. He exhaled, long and low, trying to calm the storm now spinning in his head. If Iron was part of a military experiment, one Harold had been involved in, then it explained the brand, the unnatural intelligence, and the warning letter. And it meant one thing above all else. Someone knew Iron was alive, and they wanted him gone. He couldn't go to the police, not in Pinevale, not with something like this. Who would believe a story like that? More importantly, who would protect the bull? They'd take him, study him, lock him up, or worse. Walter had no proof yet, but the pit in his stomach told him enough. He had to act before someone else did. The next morning, before the sun had risen, Walter limped through the tall grass behind his house with a toolbox in one hand and a shovel in the other. At the edge of the woods, behind a fallen tree where the ground dipped low, he began building. Boards, fencing, nails, all dragged down from the workshop. Over the course of 2 weeks, he constructed a hidden enclosure in the forest. It was slow work, but steady. Iron followed quietly, never needing to be led twice. He moved more like a companion than an animal. Every night, Walter trained him. Claps, whistles, hand gestures. Iron responded faster than Walter could have imagined. Sit, stay, back away, lower your head, follow me. It was like teaching a child who already understood the world. Walter kept his voice soft, patient. "You're not just muscle, are you?" he murmured one evening, brushing Iron's coat as the moonlight flickered through the trees. "You're thinking." Planning Iron blinked slowly, as if confirming it. But the quiet didn't last. Pinevale was a small town. Curious neighbors noticed the big shadow moving behind Walter's house. The whispers began. Walter Griggs, the old man with the monster cow. At first it was just talk, but then came the trespassers. One night, Walter was jolted awake by the sound of laughter. Distant, slurred, careless. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped onto the porch just in time to see 3 teenage boys ducking under his fence, flashlights in hand, one of them carrying a 6-pack of beer. "Hey!" Walter shouted, voice sharp, his limp forgotten for a second as he stumbled forward. "Get off my land!" The boys ignored him, stumbling toward the edge of the woods. Iron, who had been sleeping in the back pasture, stood up. His frame loomed in the moonlight, still weak but imposing. One boy froze. "What is that?" he whispered. The others laughed. "It's just a cow, dude." But Iron didn't move. He stared at them. His shoulders squared, his nostrils flared. The flashlight beams flickered. Then Iron let out a low, rumbling bellow, not loud but deep enough to make the boys step back. It wasn't aggression. It was a warning. The boys turned and ran, nearly tripping over themselves as they fled. Walter stood there long after they were gone, watching the dark tree line. He knew they'd talk, and next time, someone might come armed. 2 mornings later, Walter spotted tire tracks leading up to the far edge of his property. The side nobody had touched in years. Fresh ones. Narrow, likely from an off-road vehicle. And beside the tracks, half buried in the dirt, was something small and dark. A dart, metal tip, syringe back. He picked it up with a rag and held it in the sunlight. Tranquilizer, maybe worse. Iron was still upright, but sluggish, stumbling when he walked, blinking slower than usual. Walter's stomach sank. Someone had tried to take him down. That night, Walter strung tripwire along the outer trees, rigged a noise trap using tin cans, and locked every tool inside the garage. He started sleeping in a chair by the window, flashlight in hand, a hammer resting on his lap. His sleep was shallow, disturbed by every sound. Then came the fire. It started just after midnight. Walter woke to the sharp crack of wood splitting and a bright orange glow seeping through the window. The shed. He rushed outside, choking on the smoke. The shed beside the stall was fully engulfed, flames licking up into the sky. For a moment he panicked. Iron's stall was so close he might have been trapped. But then he saw the bull, standing outside, near the trees, staring at the fire but unharmed. Walter dragged the hose out and sprayed the shed until the flames hissed and dimmed. The fire didn't reach the house, but just barely. Then he saw it, painted in thick red strokes across his porch steps. Last warning. The letters dripped in the heat, still wet. Walter stood there trembling as the fire's glow faded behind him. They were done watching. That night, Walter didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, the dart on one side of him, the red-stained rag on the other, and the picture of Harold still lying open in front of him. He picked up the old rotary phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in 15 years. It rang 4 times before a rough voice answered. "Hello?" "Evan," Walter said, voice steady. "It's me. I need your help." A pause. Then, "Is this about Iron?" Walter blinked. "How do you know that name?" "I've been watching the news. There's talk in places I still keep an ear to. Quiet places. Someone's poking around Pinevale. What did you find?" Walter hesitated. Then he told him everything. The photo, the letters, the fire, the brand. By the end, Evan was silent. "Project Redwood," he finally muttered. "I thought they buried that thing years ago." "You were military transport, Evan. Did you ever see them? The bulls?" "Once," Evan said. In Nevada, they were still calves, locked down tighter than nuclear codes. They weren't animals, Walt. They were assets. Walter stared at the window. They left this one to die. Then someone higher up doesn't want him on the record, and they're willing to torch you to make sure of it. Walter's grip tightened around the receiver. I won't give him up. Then you'd better be ready, Evan said. Because if they know he's still alive, they won't stop until he's not. They agreed to meet 2 nights later. Evan would bring tools, a scanner, anything he had left from his old life. Walter hung up and walked out to Iron's stall. The bull lifted his head, bruised but alert. Walter reached through the rails and rested his hand on the broad forehead. We're not done yet, he said. Not by a long shot. And beyond the trees and the shifting darkness, a pair of eyes blinked, watching, waiting. From the woods beyond the pasture, a pair of eyes had been tracking Walter's every move. The tires crunched over gravel as Walter and Evan drove deep into the valley, headlights off, guided only by the dim glow of a quarter moon. Iron stood calmly in the back of the modified trailer, his heavy frame shifting with each bump in the road. The mountain air was cold, and mist curled like smoke through the trees. Walter glanced over at Evan, who gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled tension. Still think we're not being followed? Walter asked quietly, scanning the rearview mirror through the side window. No eyes on us yet, Evan muttered, adjusting the side mirror. But that won't last long. Once they notice the dart didn't work, they'll come harder. Walter nodded and turned his gaze forward, his jaw clenched tight. The night felt too still, too silent. But he trusted Evan. He always had. The old mechanics facility was buried at the end of a dried creek bed, half buried in earth and brush. It didn't look like much from the outside, just a collapsed shed and a rusted oil drum. But a hydraulic lift beneath the brush lowered the trailer into a steel-reinforced bunker once used to retrofit vehicles for survivalist clients. Walter had only seen it once years ago, when Evan had joked about being ready for the end of the world. Now it felt less like a joke. Inside, the bunker smelled of grease, ozone, and stale coffee. Evan flicked a switch, and a long row of fluorescent lights buzzed to life overhead. Tools hung neatly on the wall, and a metal examination table waited at the center. They backed the trailer in, secured the doors, and guided Iron into the room. The bull obeyed calmly, stepping onto the concrete with heavy grace. I've got something that'll help us see what they put in him, Evan said, already pulling open a storage cabinet. He retrieved a bulky, industrial-grade thermal scanner, old, military issue, and powered it on. This isn't perfect, but if there's something foreign inside, this'll light it up. Walter stroked Iron's neck, murmuring softly, Easy, big fella. Just hold still. Evan moved around Iron's shoulder, scanning inch by inch. At first, the screen showed nothing but heat and bone. Then, suddenly, a sharp, angular glow appeared beneath the bull's left shoulder blade. There, Evan said, his voice tight. Something metallic, small. He double-checked the depth reading. It's shallow, embedded just under the muscle. We can get it out. Walter looked at him. Are you sure? Evan didn't answer with words. He just opened a second case, revealing a set of sterilized surgical tools. The next hour passed in silence. Evan worked with focus, eyes narrowed, hands steady despite the tension coiling in the room. He cut carefully, parting flesh without damaging the surrounding tissue. Iron remained calm through it all, blinking slowly, body still. Then, with a soft clink, the object emerged. A tiny metallic capsule rusted at the edges, no larger than a fingernail. Evan held it up under the light. Looks like a data chip, he whispered. Old military tech. This isn't standard tagging. It's a tracker, maybe a storage unit too. He walked over to a dusty drawer and retrieved a military decoder pad, a relic from his old life. The two men exchanged a glance. Evan inserted the chip and waited. The screen flickered to life. Text scrolled quickly. Lines of code, genetic logs, timestamps, serial numbers. Then images. Dozens of them. Dozens of bulls. Each one tagged, scanned, measured. Notes beside their profiles. Enhanced sensory input. Accelerated learning curve. Cortical plasticity above 7.0. but some had different marks. A red X by their file names. Then came Iron's profile. Subject ID, RWD172, marked defective. Status, scheduled for decommission. Walter's face went pale. They were going to kill him. Evan swallowed. They probably thought they already had. More files loaded. Incident reports, transport logs. The last one detailed an equipment malfunction during a desert convoy. One bull had escaped. The entry ended abruptly. Redacted. Iron hadn't been dumped. He'd run. Walter stared at the screen, jaw tight. He's not defective. He's a survivor. That was when the lights went out. The screen blinked once, then died. What the? Evan turned toward the fuse box just as glass shattered behind them. A steel rod crashed through the narrow vent window above the workbench. Walter ducked. Iron reared slightly, letting out a warning bellow. More noise outside. Footsteps, low voices, the rattle of a lock being forced. Evan grabbed the chip and yanked it from the reader. We've got to move. But it was too late. The door burst open. A masked man in tactical gear lunged in, tackling Evan to the ground. Walter swung a wrench but missed, and the intruder shoved him back against the wall. Iron moved, fast, too fast for a creature his size. The bull's head lowered, and he charged, not to gore, but to protect. The man scrambled back, stumbling as Iron forced him out the door. Another figure appeared, and Iron spun, knocking him sideways with a powerful flank. In the chaos, someone snatched the reader. A third man slammed a pipe into Evan's shoulder before fleeing. By the time Walter pulled himself to his feet and rushed outside, the men were gone, disappeared into the woods beyond the hill. Evan lay in the dirt, groaning, his arm twisted unnaturally. Walter knelt beside him. Don't move, we'll get help. But Evan shook his head. No doctors. Not yet. Walter nodded grimly. He understood. Later, in the morning light, they assessed the damage. The reader was gone. So was the chip. But that wasn't the worst of it. Scratched into the hood of Evan's old pickup, deep and deliberate, were 3 words. You were warned. They weren't just watching anymore. They were eliminating loose ends. Walter stared at the message for a long time. The fear he felt wasn't for himself. It was for Iron. If these men were willing to break into a fortified facility and attack without hesitation, they wouldn't stop until they'd erased every trace of Project Redwood. He couldn't allow that. That same day, Walter made a second call, one he hadn't wanted to make. Dean, he said into the phone, voice low. It's Walter. I've got something you need to see. A long pause. Then the voice on the other end, gruffer than Walter remembered, replied. Is this about the bull? Walter's shoulders sagged in relief. Yeah. Dean Holloway had once been a journalist with a reputation for exposing things that weren't meant to be exposed. Chemical tests in South Carolina, a hidden prison in Arizona. He'd disappeared from the public eye years ago, claiming the truth wasn't safe anymore. They met at an old hunting cabin 2 miles north of the valley. Dean still looked the same, wiry, sharp-eyed, and always carrying a recorder. Walter told him everything. Evan's injury, the files, the chip, the raid. Dean sat silently through the entire thing. When Walter was done, he leaned forward. They won't stop, Dean said. So we make them visible. These kinds of people live in shadows. Time to rip that shadow apart. He began uploading portions of the chip's data from the backup files Evan had saved to a flash drive. They used a public library in another county to route the leaks through anonymous networks. Just enough to make people start asking questions, but not enough to lose their lead. Meanwhile, Walter and Evan fortified the property. They dug trenches, rigged noise alarms, reinforced iron stall with steel panels, and buried waterproof barrels filled with photos, data, and copies of the Redwood files. Everything was hidden beneath layers of tarp and dirt across the land, just in case. Then, just before dawn 3 days later, they came. Walter was the first to hear the tires. He looked out the window and saw them, 4 black SUVs rolling down the road with their lights off. When they stopped at the gate, armed men stepped out. They wore no insignias. Their faces were hidden, and leading them was a man in a gray coat. He didn't yell, didn't threaten. He simply stepped forward and called out, "Return the asset." No one else needs to get hurt. Walter stepped out of the barn with his hands at his sides. He's not yours. The man's lips curled. He's government property. Classified. He's alive, Walter said, and he's mine. The man raised his hand, and iron appeared from the trees. Massive, calm, ready. The agent smirked. That thing can't... Walter gave a single, sharp whistle. Iron charged. He moved like thunder, controlled, explosive. The first SUV's front tires were shredded by a spike strip buried under the dirt. The second vehicle tried to reverse, only to crash into a concealed pit. One man fired a stun round, but Iron swerved, then lunged. He struck one of the men full force, sending him through the barn wall. Screams erupted. Some fled. Others scrambled to drag their injured comrades. In under a minute, the clearing was empty again, except for the busted vehicles, the groaning of the injured, and the sound of Walter's breath in the stillness. Then he heard a soft click from the woods. He turned. A man stood just beyond the tree line, camera in hand. He didn't say a word. He just nodded once, and disappeared. By noon, the footage had hit the internet. That footage went viral within hours. 3 months later, everything had changed. Pinevale, once a sleepy town filled with suspicion and silence, had become a crossroads of opinion and curiosity. Walter Griggs stood near the fence line of his property, the early morning sun rising behind him as Iron grazed quietly in the pasture. In the distance, cameras clicked. Reporters clustered near the county road beyond the barricades, hoping to catch even a glimpse of the creature that had shaken the country's conscience. Walter wore the same jacket he always had, patched at the elbow and frayed along the collar, but something in his posture had changed. He stood straighter now, firmer. The lines on his face were no less deep, but they carried a different weight, the kind earned by a man who had stood against something bigger than himself and refused to bend. The footage of Iron charging through the field, protecting his home, had spread across every screen in America. Talk shows, websites, and opinion columns all asked the same question. Was Iron a monster or a miracle? "They still out there?" Evan asked, stepping out from the barn with a fresh cast on his arm. He carried 2 mugs of coffee, handing one to Walter. Walter nodded. "Third crew this week. That one in the blue vans from Colorado asked if Iron could do tricks." Evan smirked. "Guess protecting your land from armed agents isn't impressive enough." Walter chuckled dryly and took a sip. Back inside, Dean Holloway sat at the kitchen table surrounded by printouts, redacted files, and scrawled notes. He was talking on a burner phone, his voice low but intense. "The committee wants me in D.C. next week," he muttered once he hung up. "They're forming a subcommittee to look into unauthorized bioengineering projects, something about new legislation to restrict private defense labs." Walter leaned against the doorframe. "Do they know who was behind Redwood?" Dean shook his head. "Not yet. Every lead ends in silence, some kind of deep-scrubbed network. Whoever was running it, they knew how to vanish." "So what now?" Evan asked. "We just wait?" "No," Walter said, his voice firm. "We protect what we have." The news that Iron was not only real, but the product of an illegal government-adjacent experiment, sent ripples far beyond Pinevale. Protests broke out in larger cities, demanding regulation and transparency. Some called for Iron to be euthanized, fearing what he represented. Others wanted him preserved as living evidence. But neither side understood the truth. Iron wasn't a weapon. He was a survivor. Thanks to Dean's leaks and a viral movement dubbed Number Protect Iron, Congress rushed through an emergency ethics bill recognizing genetically unique non-human entities with demonstrated sentience as legally protected. It was clumsy wording, but it worked. Iron was safe. For now. Walter declined every interview. When the networks offered money, huge amounts, he simply said, "He's not for sale." Instead, Walter built a new enclosure, a training field, a reading bench beneath the old oak where he used to sit with his late wife. And each morning, rain or shine, he walked out with a book, sat beside Iron, and read aloud. "Today at Steinbeck," Walter would announce, holding up the tattered copy. "You'll like this one." Iron always lay down beside him, eyes half-lidded, tail flicking lazily. If a camera lens peeked over the fence, Walter ignored it. Sometimes Evan joined them, bringing tools to repair the fence or helping reinforce the trap systems buried just beyond the tree line. Dean visited often, always with updates or rumors. Walter listened, never forgetting that safety was only borrowed, not guaranteed. One afternoon, Dean sat beside him, watching Iron move slowly through the grass. You ever think about what it means? That this bull, this creature, was meant to be a weapon? And now he's just listening to books. Walter folded his hands over his cane. That's the point, isn't it? They tried to turn him into something he wasn't, but they failed. He didn't become a tool. He became himself. The wind moved through the grass in slow waves. Iron raised his head toward it, nostrils flaring. Dean nodded. Poetic. Walter didn't smile, but his eyes were warm. Doesn't need to be poetry. Just truth. Despite the calm, Walter never truly let his guard down. There were signs. Strange cars parked on rural roads. A drone that hovered too low before vanishing into the clouds. Once, a tree near the property line was marked with red chalk, a signal he hadn't seen since Harold's time in logistics. Walter simply adjusted the perimeter again. Iron trained every other day. Not for show, not for violence, but to stay sharp. Walter never forced it. He didn't need to. He had found something rare in the old bull, something no project or experiment could fabricate. Loyalty. One evening, as the sun set fire to the sky, Walter sat with Iron near the ridge. Pinevale spread out beneath them like a quilt. You changed things, you know, Walter whispered. Not just me, not just this place. People out there, they're talking, asking questions, fighting back, all because you survived. Iron shifted closer, his breath warm against Walter's shoulder. Walter reached out and scratched the thick hide behind his ear. He thought of the years spent in silence, in aching loneliness. He remembered the first time he heard Iron's ragged breathing, tangled in wire, half dead. He hadn't known then what he was saving, but now every morning brought reason. Every sunrise gave him purpose. Because when a man finds something worth protecting, even if it's a bull bred in secret, he also finds something he didn't know he needed. A reason to fight, a reason to live.